Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the discussion of the events of January 6th and the future of American democracy. This is a VPAL signature event brought to you by Harvard's Office for the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning, the Harvard Government Department, and socializeremotely.harvard.edu. I'm Ryan Enos. I'm a professor of government in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And I want to thank all the guests for being here and especially the alumni for joining us tonight. We're here to discuss with distinguished scholars the attack on the US Capitol on January 6th and what it meant for US democracy. I think it's fair to say that this attack profoundly shocked the nation. And given that the attack was deeply implicated in politics, it's important to try to understand it by hearing from experts in the study of politics. Now, while any violence, and certainly large-scale violence, deserves study and explanation, the January 6th attacks implicated democracy in a way that perhaps other violence has not, because the attack came from actors who were, at the very least in message, clearly associated with the sitting president and was motivated by questions of representation, power, law, among other things. Indeed, this violence came as a result of the election and in the midst of preparations for the peaceful transfer of power to a new leader. Those are, in many ways, the very things that define a representative democracy. In the span of in exactly 2 weeks, the US Capitol building, the symbolic heart of US democracy, went from fending off a violent mob to witnessing the impeachment of the president to the inauguration of a new president. And so here we are exactly 1 week later after all of that. And what we want to know is, how did we get here and what does this mean for the future? Among other questions, does it demonstrate the resilience or perhaps the weakness of US democracy? To help answer these questions, we've gathered some of the world's leading experts on democracy, political mobilization, protest, constitutional law, and other topics. I'll introduce them to you now in alphabetical order. Erica Chenoweth is the Berthold Beitz Professor of Human Rights and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Chenoweth directs a nonviolent action lab at Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, where they study political violence and its alternatives. Chenoweth's forthcoming book is Civil Resistance: What Everyone Needs to Know. Chenoweth is also the author of 6 other books and a number of scholarly articles. Among other awards, in 2014, Chenoweth received the Carl Deutsch Award, which the International Studies Association gives annually to the scholar under the age of 40 who has made the greatest impact on the field of international politics or peace research. Richard Fallon is Story Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School and an affiliate professor in the Harvard Government Department. Fallon was a Rhodes Scholar and served as a law clerk for Justice Lewis F. Powell of the United States Supreme Court. Fallon has written extensively about constitutional law and federal courts law and is the author of The Dynamic Constitution, among several other books. Among his many honors, Fallon is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the American Law Institute. Claudine Gay is the Edgerley Family Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. But before she reached those lofty ranks, we knew her as a faculty member in the Government Department, where she is still the Wilbur A. Cowett Professor of Government and African American Studies, where she has been on faculty since 2006. She is the founding chair of the Inequality in America Initiative at Harvard, a multidisciplinary effort launched in 2017. Gay studies political behavior, considering issues in her research such as how did the election of minority office holders affect citizens' perceptions of their government and their interest in politics and public affairs, how neighborhood environments shape racial and political attitudes among Black Americans, and the roots of competition and cooperation between minority groups. Harvey Mansfield is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard. He is also a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. He has held Guggenheim and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships and has been a fellow at the National Humanities Center. He also received the National Humanities Medal in 2004 and delivered the Jefferson Lecture, considered the highest honor the federal government bestows for distinguished intellectual and public achievements in humanities. Among other topics and works of translation, Mansfield has written on Edmund Burke and the nature of political parties, on Machiavelli and the invention of indirect government, in defense of defensible liberalism, and on the discovery and development of the theory of executive power. Since arriving at Harvard in 1949 and joining the faculty in 1962, Mansfield students have included some of the most influential American politicians and thinkers in the last half century. And finally, Daniel Ziblatt is the Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard and the Director of the Transformation of Democracy Group at the Weise Bay Berlin Social Science Center. He specializes in the study of Europe and the history of democracy. His 3 books include How Democracies Die from 2018, a New York Times bestseller translated into 22 languages, and also Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, released that same year in 2018, which is an account of Europe's historical democratization and won the American Political Science Association's 2018 Woodrow Wilson Prize for the best book in American Government and International Relations and American Sociological Association's 2018 Barrington Moore Prize. So needless to say, this is a distinguished panel and we're fortunate to have them here. Before I turn it to them, I want to run through a few housekeeping items for those joining us. All participants are going to remain muted for the duration of this event. We'll be taking questions for the panel, however, and we really want to hear from you. If you want to do that, please don't use the chat function. Only use the chat function to contact us about technical issues you might be experiencing. Instead, to submit a question, please use the question and answer button on the bottom of the Zoom window. There you can submit questions and view questions from other participants, and you can even upvote questions that resonate with you, and we'll try more to answer those. This event is also being live streamed on YouTube. So for those of you watching the YouTube stream, we have a moderator there to assist you with any technical difficulties and transmit to us any questions you may have that we can also ask our panelists. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to give an opening remarks of about 5 minutes, and then we'll turn over to discussion and answer your questions. So without further ado, Erica Chenoweth, please.
Thank you, Ryan. Good evening, everyone. And it's a real honor and privilege to be on this panel with these amazing colleagues. And thanks to everybody for joining us as well. Look forward to the discussion. So for the past 4 years, my colleague Jeremy Pressman at the University of Connecticut and I have been crowdsourcing data on protest, counter-protest, police response, and the trends that we can observe and how people have been gathering around the country to either protest against Trump and his policies, to protest and rally for Trump and his policies, and a range of other issues. And what I want to say first about January 6th is that it can help us to make sense of that event, to think about it as the culmination of years of mobilization and counter-mobilization that we've seen on the streets of America over the past 4 years at least, and going further back than that. But let me just focus on the past 4 years. So the day after Trump was inaugurated on January 21st of 2017, the US saw the largest single-day mass mobilization in US history. The 2017 Women's March was the largest public demonstration that had ever been recorded in a single day in the US, with millions of people turning out in at least 634 locations around the country, and hundreds of thousands of others around the world mobilizing nonviolent resistance against Trump and his agenda. Later that year, we saw a stark contrast with the mobilization in Charlottesville. The mobilization in Charlottesville was essentially a counter-protest that was also pro-state, in this instance pro-Trump. And the counter-protest featured white nationalists, white supremacists, and neo-fascists, anti-Semites, and anti-Black racists who were essentially using the occasion to terrorize the population that had lost power during the 2016 elections and claimed that they were essentially marching forward. So these were kind of polar opposite events in many regards, but one thing that carried forth from Charlottesville was this pattern of mobilization and counter-mobilization, that is protest and counter-protest. Charlottesville itself was a microcosm of this, with Black Lives Matter, anti-fascist, and other liberal activists who were actually there to counter-protest those events themselves. And over the next couple of years, we also saw incredibly important patterns of protest develop across a broad range of groups and sectors in the US. So for example, in 2018, we saw the largest single day mobilization, if you count the number of locations where mobilizations were taking place, with the March for Our Lives, which was the pro-gun control demonstrations led by students in the wake of the Parkland High School shooting. There were over 4,400 separate events on a single day that included walkouts and marches. And then in 2020, we saw the largest and broadest mass mobilization ever recorded in US history with the Black-led multiracial anti-racism uprisings that followed in the wake of George Floyd's killing and uplifted the killings of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and were the culmination of generations worth of mobilization against police brutality and anti-Blackness more broadly. And you know, the movement for Black Lives mobilizations this last summer brought out thousands of demonstrations from May to August of 2020. It featured between 15 and 25 million Americans who claimed to have attended at least one racial justice protest. And it also began to feature a much more visible armed counter-protest presence. So in addition to showing heightening incidents of police brutality at the protests themselves, there were also heightened street fights and other type of skirmishes with armed counter-protesters that look very similar to the ones that were present at Charlottesville in 2017. These forces had been kind of emboldened by several high-profile activities during the reopen and liberation, quote, liberation protests in April of 2020 in response to COVID pandemic lockdowns. You know, we're also implicated in a kidnapping and an assassination attempt of Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan in October. And so we really have seen these groups interplaying with one another. And I think what happened in the aftermath of the election is that President Trump broadened the grievances by claiming that the election had been fraudulently won by Joe Biden, broadened the grievances of those erstwhile extremist groups to a much broader segment of Americans who felt that they had voted for him and that that actually the election was stolen, who then became willing to essentially deploy these same tactics that they had seen used elsewhere. So on January 6th, we saw the third of several Stop the Steal protests in Washington, D.C. The quote unquote Save America March brought out tens of thousands of participants, several thousand of which then marched down to the Capitol from the ellipse at Trump's encouragement and then violently assaulted the Capitol. So I think that this is indicative of an escalation of contentious political behavior that is often seen in contexts where you have deeply polarized partisan polarization, and you also have street politics that's both fueled by and fueling the nature of that polarization. So I think I'll stop there and weigh in later when we get some questions about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica, very much. Dick Fallon, please.
So thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you, everybody who's listening. I'm very honored to be involved in this. As a law professor, I thought that what I would do is to offer some reflections on the events of January 6th and what they can teach us about the Constitution, its strengths and its weaknesses. As Americans, we're used to being assured that we have the best Constitution in the world, that our institutions are strong, that our institutions will save us from various kinds of threats, and indeed that our constitutional institutions were very much part of what helped us to survive the Trump presidency as well as we did. I think that some of the lessons that we ought to be drawing are more troubling or more challenging. So let me begin with a constitutional provision for electing presidents by voting in the states individually and then through state voting in the Electoral College. I start here because the rioters at the Capitol on January 6th sought to interrupt the certification of votes by the Electoral College. The Electoral College voting system, which the Constitution prescribes, makes it possible for the candidate who receives the most popular votes not to be elected president. That's happened twice in the last 6 presidential elections, in 2000 and in 2016. The system of voting in the Electoral College is not only anti-democratic, it also puts undue strain on the processes of voting and vote counting in individual states in close elections. So recall that the January 6th rioters wanted to overturn the results of the November election by challenging the outcomes in only a handful of states. Turning from the Electoral College to the president's role in the events leading up to and culminating in the January 6th riot also highlights weaknesses in our constitutional system. The Constitution gives the president access to a multitude of levers of power that are conspicuously prone to abuse. And President Trump repeatedly used those levers of power in abusive ways in the period between the election and January 6th, just as he had throughout his presidency. But the problem is not that the president possesses powers that are capable of abuse. It's hard to imagine a situation that could be otherwise. The problem is that a number of the Constitution's intended mechanisms for checking presidential abuses no longer work as intended and cannot be relied upon any longer to work as intended. In the 4 years leading up to January 6th, including the period after the 2020 election, congressional Republicans who controlled the Senate throughout failed to exert any substantial check on Trump's misbehavior. The failure of the constitutional system of checks and balances can be attributed largely to dynamics of party politics that the Constitution's framers did not foresee. The founding generation hoped that ambition would counteract ambition in the sense that Congress would rise to protect congressional prerogatives against executive overreach and misbehavior. But experience has shown that members of Congress seldom wish to check a president of their own political party. For one thing, they tend to care more about the party agenda than about protecting institutional prerogatives. For another thing, members of Congress who deviate from the party line in an attempt to check the president of their own party make themselves vulnerable to challenge in party primaries. It was the unwillingness of congressional Republicans to act as a check on Trump that made his first impeachment trial a quixotically partisan spectacle, and that allowed his followers to believe that their efforts to undermine the results of the 2016 election might actually succeed. Even with Trump out of office, it now seems clear that the overwhelming majority of Republicans will refuse to condemn his abuses in office in the forthcoming second impeachment trial. The lesson to be drawn, I think, is that our constitutional institutions are no better and no stronger than the people who occupy them. And if the occupants of constitutional institutions will not rise to do their duties, the Constitution by itself will not save us. If I stopped now, it could be objected that I've told only half the story. Some institutions of constitutional government and their inhabitants performed conspicuously well in the events leading to and surrounding January 6th. First, state and local leaders with direct responsibility for getting votes counted and certified appear to have performed with extraordinary courage. But I think we owe more thanks to them than we do to the Constitution. Second, courts largely behaved like courts rather than like partisans. Even Republican state court judges and federal judges who were appointed by Trump overwhelmingly dismissed claims of electoral fraud that were unsupported by evidence. Nevertheless, looking to the future, it would be a mistake to think that courts will save us from pathologies of American politics that the events of January 6th exhibited. Among other things, the courts have protected the partisan gerrymandering that helps to empower some of Congress's most virulent partisans. So overall, the largest message I am hoping to convey in these preliminary remarks is that if we escape disaster on January 6th, it is not because the structures of democracy that the Constitution creates provide anything like a fail-safe. To the contrary, many aspects of our system are ill-designed to meet current challenges. Right now, our political culture is in a shambles. But if our future is to be rescued, as I certainly hope that it can be, the rescue will have to come through reforms of our politics that the Constitution does not require, and in some cases may actually inhibit. So as I sit here tonight, I look to those on this panel who are the political experts to provide political wisdom. There's not as much help coming from the Constitution as you might hope for.
Thank you, Dick. And with that, we'll turn to the political expert, Claudine Gay, please.
Oh, dear. Well, first of all, thank you, Ryan. And also thank you, my fellow panelists. I feel like just your opening remarks alone have already enriched and elevated my thinking about the January 6th attack and its implications. So as a scholar of American political behavior, sifting through the wreckage of January 6th for insight about the future of American democracy, my attention turns almost immediately to the historic election whose results the mob repudiated and sought to overturn. And the election was historic not only for who emerged as victorious, but also for the record voter turnout that we witnessed really across the country. Not only in November, but a pattern that repeated itself earlier this month in the Georgia Senate runoffs. So more than 159 million Americans voted in November, many for the first time. And that's the largest total number of ballots cast in US history by a very wide margin. And the turnout rate, as a percentage of the voting eligible population was 67%, the highest in more than 120 years. And what's significant is that this is in a country that honestly is without peer among established democracies in the structural barriers that we erect between citizens and the ballot. From voter registration procedures that put the onus on citizens. So, people have to go take the step to actually register to vote rather than being automatically registered. Procedures that require advanced planning because often, registration deadlines are usually many weeks before an election. A process that has to then be repeated every time there's a residential move, all the way up until election day, timed for a weekday, and then facing limited polling places and typically inconsistent access to early voting and mailing voting. We really make voting a hassle in the US. And so it's no wonder that when we're compared against our peers, so if we look at OECD countries, we rank 30th out of 35 when it comes to our average rates of voter turnout. And then if that were not enough, the last 20 years has witnessed just really an extraordinary, almost industrial scale and highly partisan campaign across many states to erect still more barriers to the ballot, to make voting even more difficult, all under the pretext of combating what the historian Carol Anderson has called the phantom menace of voter fraud. So we have restrictive and cumbersome voter ID laws, more frequent purges of voter rolls, consolidation of polling places. And these efforts all impose costs that can put the seemingly simple but profound act of voting out of reach. And they've been disproportionately effective in suppressing voter turnout among people of color, low-income adults, young people, despite the fact that these groups, like all Americans, have a lot at stake in the political process. But in November, citizens overcame all of those obstacles to turn out in record numbers and really to demand that their voices be heard. And in Georgia, they turned out again earlier this month in the Senate runoffs that resulted in the historic victory by Raphael Warnock. In fact, 76,000 new voters registered in Georgia just in the period between the November election and the January runoff. And this was not magic, but rather the culmination of years of really deep organizing and grassroots mobilization by advocacy groups, such as the New Georgia Project, which registered over 500,000 people just in the last 6 years. All, again, inspired by the idea of democracy as an active, collaborative process, and prepared to push against a system that really is built to make voting difficult. And this organizing effort around voter registration, not just in Georgia, but really across the country, almost certainly lays the groundwork for similar efforts in the future. And so, I say all of this because I've really been searching, again, despite the wreckage of January 6th, for reasons to feel nonetheless hopeful about some dimensions of the future of American democracy. The mob on January 6th sought to achieve through violence what voter ID laws and poll closures could not, which is to silence the voices of millions on the belief that it is the very participation of, for example, people of color that renders an election illegitimate. But the lies and the rage that converged on the Capitol are not the only animating force in American politics at this moment. I think so too is an expanding electorate and millions of citizens who in many ways are newly awake to the transformative power of the vote. And I believe much more determined to be part of the democratic process and to demand to be equitably represented in government. And so as I look ahead, that's the dynamic that gives me hope, because our democracy, however imperfect, which it is, I firmly believe is made better the more we all participate.
Thank you, Claudine. Harvey Mansfield, please.
Thanks for having me. I'm the Republican on the panel. I would be happy to share the honor, but I think I'm going to have it to myself. Shared honors are diminished, so let's go with it. I'm not going to talk about Republicans, not now anyway. I want to talk about Donald Trump. And first to say that I think he richly deserves to be impeached and also to be convicted. Whether that's constitutional or not is perhaps a question, and whether it will happen, also a question. Still, he deserves it. As much, the rioters who crashed the Capitol deserve to be heavily punished. We should throw the book at them or hit them with a ton of bricks. And this would have a good effect on both the right and the left, but have been rioting elsewhere in the country. So I'm going to talk about a political lesson and with a very short moral lesson at the end of it. I want to treat Donald Trump as a demagogue. A demagogue is something which is as old as the hills. It's as old as democracy is. Demagogue is a person who is a spokesman or an actor for the demos, Greek word for the people. So a demagogue is a democratic figure. He doesn't come from outside democracy. And he's analyzed in classical political science by Plato and Aristotle, and also strongly considered by the American founders, the makers of the Constitution. The demos are the people as opposed to the few, not the people as including everybody. The hoi polloi, a disparaging term which we still use, the many. The demos, the demagogue leaves the demos against the few, against the elite, the rich, the establishment. This is what Donald Trump did. He picked up that phrase, the establishment, from the dissidents of the late 60s. The demos is vulgar as opposed to refined. Educated people or people who read books. Trump is a coarse man, and he appeals to the coarse. He's a vulgar man who appeals to the worst instincts in the people. Of course, the vulgar can also be good-hearted, but that isn't what Trump appealed to. He does, now does he use the people, the demagogue, use the people, or do the people use him? Plato and Aristotle say it's the latter, that the demagogue is the instrument of the people. The demagogue has no opinions of his own. He doesn't produce an ism. There isn't really any such thing as Trumpism. His opinions are accidental. He picks up his opinions according to what he thinks will provide him a path to power. And the demos is pushing him rather than he taking them. Trump could have been a Democrat with contrary opinions. Nothing prevents it. He's a deal maker. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. To make deals, you mustn't have strong principles. The demagogue seeks to be close to the people. In the 2016 campaign, in his debate with Hillary Clinton, Hillary said to the audience, "You are with me." Trump said, "I am with you." Now, how did Trump get close or closer to the people? In three ways, I think. First, through rallies, an old-fashioned way, say, goes back to the days of the populist leaders, William Jennings Bryan, and also through tweets, his famous tweets, which are short and punchy with raw humor. This was his way of getting around the media. The media are part of the establishment that he opposes. The media, for its part, followed him as closely as it could. Trump was always center stage during his presidency, even more when he was attacked. The New York Times doubled its circulation during his presidency. So a third way of getting close to the people is being outrageous with brazen insults against women, for example, Megyn Kelly, Carly Fiorina. It's also to be outrageous, you can break the norms of politeness, of politics. You can be bold. You can get attention and admiration from his followers. You can attack political correctness as he did. He was the only Republican to use this issue on which I think the Democrats are quite weak. Political correctness, euphemisms, for example, undocumented aliens. Why don't they have documents? Because they're here illegally. So Trump made fun of that kind of thing. The Proud Boys at the Capitol were were outrageous, extra manly, super manly. white supremacists among them or white nationalists, but that didn't matter to Trump. If you like Trump, he'll like you. So his problem is not that he discriminates, but that he doesn't discriminate in his followers. So conclusions, what do we say? First, study the Trump voters. They are more interesting than Trump is, actually. This has been done by a sociologist at Berkeley, Arlie Hochschild, in her book, Strangers in This Land, which was actually written before Trump and sort of predicted the sort of, studied the sort of people who turned out to be his voters. And his second conclusion is to distinguish our democracy, to which Donald Trump is a great danger, from democracy simply. There's a distinction between what is demotic, that is simply popular, and what is democratic, that is what makes it possible for the people to rule successfully and for us to have self-government. Our democracy, the one that Trump attacked, is a constitutional democracy with elections and institutions, the separation of powers, which was under attack by the mob in the Capitol riot. Therefore, our democracy has an elite, an establishment. Those are especially people with ambition, who want to be unequal in some way, have an impact, as Harvard students like to say. So our democracy needs an establishment. Our democracy's establishment is elected by the people. It's not an oligarchy of strangers. And it does, I think, have justifiable privileges of wealth and especially of honor. So that's a few words on Trump the demagogue. My moral lesson is very quick. Donald Trump lost the election in 2020 because he was vain. His vanity distracted him from the promotion of his record. And he is disgraced in 2021 because he doesn't know how to lose. Having a bad character, say, can trip you up, can warp and destroy your judgment and ruin your self-interest. So at the end, I'll remark, don't think that morals and politics are separate. Thanks.
Thank you, Harvey. And finally, Daniel Ziblatt, please.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, colleagues, also for the fascinating presentations. So the biggest puzzle, I think, and the most worrying development in American politics today, vividly highlighted by the events on January 6th, is the extreme radicalization of the American Republican Party. Large segments of the Republican Party today appear unwilling to accept the results of free and fair elections, and also seem unwilling to unambiguously distance themselves from actors who think it is appropriate to use violence to gain and to hold on to power. The record, I think, is pretty clear. The Republican Party is no longer a traditional center-right party like Europe's Christian Democrats and center-right parties. In fact, on its best days, it's much more similar to the fringe radical right political parties of Europe. And on its worst days, it fits to a T the hallmarks of what Juan Linz, the great Spanish scholar of democracy, called an anti-system party, those political actors that accompanied democracy's breakdown in much of Europe in the 1930s. So this is really a remarkable and consequential development. In addition, it's very surprising for political scientists' models of electoral politics. In a two-party system like the United States, if you go wildly off course, you should be punished at the ballot box. Like a failing firm, you fire the CEO, you hire new middle management, you come up with a new market strategy, you regroup. And indeed, if you ask moderate never-Trumper Republicans today, what will get Republicans back on course, the answer usually is devastating electoral losses. They say Republicans just need to lose. Now, there is some wisdom, I think, in this view. Democracy is supposed to operate as a self-correcting electoral marketplace. Competition should moderate. But two unrelated developments have collided at our current moment to render the normal self-correcting operation of our electoral marketplace dysfunctional. The first is a long-run shift in electoral geography. In the past, cities in the countryside had a mix of Republicans and Democratic voters. Slow-moving demographic changes and the long-run realignment of our parties after the enfranchisement of African Americans in the South in 1965 have changed that. Today's cities are more and more uniformly Democratic, and rural areas are more and more Republican. Indeed, the correlation between population density and the share of the vote for Democrats today is higher than at any point in the last century. So this is the first development. This has crashed into a second factor, though, our Constitution, which hasn't changed. Our Constitution has long favored, of course, rural areas. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated areas. So too is the US Senate, with 2 representatives from each state, no matter the population of the state. And because the Senate approves the president's Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is also biased in the same way. Now, for the first 200 years of our history, of course, this bias had little partisan effect because both parties had urban and rural wings. But today, this correlation between party and population density means the Republicans have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Our constitutional system is systematically biased in favor of Republicans. Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency only one time since 1988. And Republicans have only won the popular vote once in the last 20 years, but have held the presidency 12 of those 20 years. In the Senate, we see a similar story. The Democrats routinely win more total votes, but Republicans often still manage to hold on to control of the Senate. And finally, over the past 3 years, we've had 3 Supreme Court justices appointed by a president who lost the popular vote, but also confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. Now, understand, in principle, I'm all for counter-majoritarian defenses of individual liberties, the Bill of Rights, the judiciary. These are, of course, very important. But counter-majoritarian institutions consistently benefiting one party over another is something different, and it's having a destructive and distorting impact on the Republican Party. Republicans have become beneficiaries of what I kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek think we can call constitutional welfare or constitutional protectionism, a set of institutions that dull the incentive to compete. If you can win regularly the most important offices in the land without seeking out more diverse voters, why do it? Especially when your base is telling you to radicalize. Republicans are in the tightening grip of a self-reinforcing spiral being pushed by their non-urban conservative white base to radicalize, and our institutions provide no counterweight, no incentives to adapt. In the economic realm, we of course know that protectionism can distort firm behavior. In the political realm, economic protectionism can distort party behavior. This is all dangerous for American democracy. Tocqueville famously worried about the tyranny of the majority in America. Today, the bigger threat is not tyranny of the majority, but its opposite, minority rule. A political system that repeatedly allows a minority party to control the most powerful offices in the land cannot remain legitimate for long. Democracy requires certainly more than majority rule, of course, but without majority rule, there is no democracy. And it is distorting one of our 2 major political parties in the process. This cries out for reform. And I think there's only one way out, to push for a series of reform that empower majorities, that allows the electoral marketplace to operate. This includes a whole series of voting rights reforms that we've already heard a bit about that make it easier to vote, the elimination of the filibuster, the extension of statehood to Washington, D.C., and yes, even getting rid of the Electoral College. This will make our democracy more democratic, but more than that, it will also allow the electoral marketplace to work to diminish the distorting and radicalizing effects of constitutional protectionism on the Republican Party. This ultimately, I believe, is the way to save our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the antecedents of the riot, going all the way back to our constitutional system, to events that happened in the past year and in the Trump presidency, to some underlying issues we might describe with our political party and the population more largely. I want to remind people that are listening that we questions are open, and if you have them, please ask them. I'm going to start with at least a couple of my own, and then hopefully we'll have a lot of time to turn to questions from the audience. So please ask those if you have ones you want to ask. I do want to start with just a question to understand more about how we should characterize this event. And I'm going to start by asking Erica Chenoweth, but I invite anybody else to please jump in. Erica, are there any comparative or historical examples that we could point to that are similar in other countries or in the United States to the January 6th insurrection? And are there any lessons we can take away from those about how this might affect democracy?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I mean, I think I'm one of the people that's gotten very comfortable calling this an attempted coup, notwithstanding the various kind of categorical, definitional controversies about that. It was an attempt by an incumbent to essentially overturn the results of an election through irregular and extra constitutional means. And so it's a certain kind of self-coup, an auto golpe. As far as I know, we haven't had any examples of this take place in the US at the national office level until now. Although part of that may be because people who were capable of or motivated to do such things resigned before they were able to carry them out. But I do want to point out a couple of things about the nature of this episode. You know, some people say that in order for an episode like this to count as a coup, that the person has to mobilize the military effectively to intervene on their behalf. What's really important about this instance is that Trump did try to effectively mobilize various parts of the US security apparatus to maintain his hold on power. Not only did he sack and replace senior defense and justice officials in key moments leading up to and after the after the November election, but he also has gone out of his way to play nice with police, knowing that in the event of some kind of mass mobilization, police would be frontline defenders of the sort of law and order status quo. He also actively stoked and mobilized what, if we saw it in another country, we'd call paramilitary forces to intervene on his behalf at the Capitol and elsewhere. He issued pardons several weeks before the January 6th assault to war criminals, which could be taken as a direct sign that he would be willing to pardon anybody who took extra constitutional, militarized or militant measures to keep him in power. And of course, he pressured GOP officials at every level and tried to pressure even the Supreme Court to intervene on his behalf to overturn the election. If that isn't a coup, I don't actually know what is. And the fact that the coup failed doesn't mean that it wasn't an attempted coup. Finally, I'll say the US has seen a coup before, and it was at the local level. This took place in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where a white supremacist mob who was angry at the rising power of a biracial party called the Fusion Party that had won the city council and mayoral elections, stormed a Black-owned newspaper, the Daily Record, and burned it to the ground, ran its editor out of town. And massacred at least 60 people, maybe even several hundred people, and installed the white supremacist mob leaders as city council members and as the mayor. And that episode in our history went essentially erased for decades until the centennial, when Black historians and survivors of some of the victims of that massacre essentially began to recover and excavate that history and bring it to light. And there's been some really important work done on that lately. But this is just to say that the incident that we saw on January 6th is echoed and resonant throughout the history of the country. These are not new issues, but it is a new kind of novel threat in our generation to sort of let them go unheeded and to not fully grasp the same kind of ghosts of the past that are marching around unfettered and unpunished at this point in our history.
Thank you, Erica. I should say to my panelists, when I ask these questions, if anybody wants to jump in, just take yourself off mute after I direct it to somebody. Daniel, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I know less about this than my colleague Steve Levitsky, but just in the last 2 years in Ecuador as well as in El Salvador, the president sort of essentially armed mobs have attacked the Congress. In El Salvador, the president, in the US, at that rally on January 6th, President Trump said, "I'll be there with you." And of course he wasn't. He went back to the White House. In El Salvador in February 2020, so a year ago, the president was with the mob and he showed up and sat down in the Congress and essentially, so it's a very, very similar kind of events, different though in the sense that these were similar in that this is a kind of institutional warfare between the branches of government taking a real form, different in that these were efforts essentially by popular presidents to try to get their way in a normal legislative process. It wasn't about the succession of power, which I think in some ways even is a more fragile and fraught situation. But obviously in our own country, this is something that's much more unusual.
Can I make a remark? I would say to Dan Ziblatt and to Richard Fallon that the Republicans did resist this coup, if you want to call it, and this, especially in the work of Mike Pence, who is, I think, my candidate for the noblest fellow in the Trump administration. You can speak against the Republicans, and they deserve some of it, but the fact is that their party was hijacked by Donald Trump. So I don't think it's correct to blame everything that's happened, especially on January 6th, on Republicans. And they did put up a fight, and I think we'll see what happens on the impeachment. But it's a difficult thing when a demagogue hijacks your party. Think how you would behave if it happened to you. So, and it's true that on the one hand, the Republicans enabled Donald Trump, but on the other hand, he enabled them. He wasn't able to make deals with Democrats and Republicans the way a demagogue, I think, normally would, partly because the Democrats from the beginning followed a mode of resistance to him and weren't open to making deals. But so he was therefore constrained to follow a policy program of pretty normal Republican things, tax cuts, deregulation, somewhat stronger foreign policy, and things of that sort. And then it's difficult when somebody takes over like that. You don't know how to behave. My conservative friends ran the gamut from never Trumpers to actual Trumpistas. And especially it was difficult for Republican office holders who were open, as was said, to primary challenges that would make them vulnerable. So you have to distinguish between the Republicans and Trump. And while you're at it, look at home, look at the Democratic Party. They almost were hijacked by a demagogue, Bernie Sanders. Wasn't even a Democrat, socialist, a man who spent his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. Think of that, how close you came. And if it hadn't been for intelligent Black voters in the state of South Carolina saying Biden might not have been nominated. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Harvey. I think Claudine wants to jump in on this point.
Yeah, actually, just quite briefly, it's not so much jumping in on this thread, but just expressing appreciation for Erica, your comment, reminding us of the historical precedents and using the example of Wilmington, which I think is excellent and so fitting for this particular case, because, you know, what we anticipated was going to be the dominant headline of January 6th was Raphael Warnock as the first Black Democratic senator from the South in the nation's history. And so the proximity of that salient event and, you know, the mob attack just, again, I mean, in your comments, it just rings loudly with these echoes of the past and really what is a long history of campaigns to suppress Black political power. I mean, I think the reality is that we are still struggling to build a genuine multiracial democracy in this country. And the effort to preserve white political domination continues. The desire to erase whole groups of people from American political life, you know, that continues. And it's a threat to all of us, not just to people of color, but literally to all of us, to the Constitution and our democracy. And one of the things that January 6th makes clear is the fact that it's a broad-based threat. That, you know, at particular moments and in particular places, a threat that actually erupts into physical violence.
So if I could get in here to make a brief comment, it would be this. From my perspective, what happened on January 6th is in one sense unprecedented. There's never been anything exactly like it. One of the things that helped us get out as easily as we did, I think, was actually Trump's ineptitude. This was not an organized coup attempt manipulated by Trump from the top in the way that a competent party leader or president after 4 years presumably would have been able to operate a coup if that was what he or she wanted to achieve. It was outsourced to the Proud Boys, among others, which is not the way one would expect a really competent demagogue or powerful institutional figure to operate. There are other ways in which what happened has terrifying resonances with things that have happened in the past. And this is where I want to pick up on what Erica had been saying. And I want to connect that with something that Harvey said by way of juxtaposition, because there's something that frightens me and I don't know how to resolve it. The thread brought out by Erica is that one of the driving forces behind what was going on January 6th and in the run-up to January 6th and throughout the Trump demagoguery was the politics, if that's even the right word, the politics of race. This is a movement driven in very substantial ways by race and anxiety about racial status. So says Erica, and a lot of that resonates with me as I try to understand what's going on. Harvey says, what do you do when your party is hijacked? And so implicit in that characterization is the idea that there is out there a group of people who would be, a large number of people who would be much happier at home in a traditional center-right party, such as maybe our Republican Party has been, certainly such as there are in Europe and elsewhere, and they've been hijacked by the racists. And so if there's hope, there is hope that these two threads can be pried apart and the race somehow racial part isolated as a pathology that doesn't afflict everybody disposed to be with a center-right party or a majority or even much more than a minority. That's the hope. But the fear, and this again is Erica, and to some extent what Claudine was saying, is that it might be otherwise. And that's why I say I look at these things from a constitutional perspective. I don't have the political insight that many of you have, but this is what I'm worried about. Do we have the foundations of a responsible, stable, center-right party? And I will say this to Harvey. I voted for, I am not a Republican, but I have voted for Republicans, and I've even given money to Republican candidates. And so I'm not wholly hostile to the Republican Party.
So let me, in the name of democracy, I'm going to cut this thread off because I want to turn to some questions from our audience. And I do hope we can come back to something that's been implicit in what a lot of people talk about, which are institutional reforms, and particularly things like the Republican Party, because, for example, Daniel Ziblatt has argued, as Dick Fallon is saying, that center-right parties are critical to democracy, at least democratization. So we can talk more about that. But we have a lot of questions in the audience. And actually, again, in the name of democracy, the one that's been upvoted a lot and I think is on everybody's mind. So I want to turn to some people to try to answer it. And I will turn to Daniel Ziblatt. Is this top question was, what is the chance that this is from an anonymous attendee, which I think it means it's coming over YouTube. So this might be from an alumni out there, wants to know, what is the chance that American democracy will fail within the next 3 decades? Pointing to the concern about democracy ending the way it did in Nazi Germany has been raised often. So whether by the route of Nazi Germany or something else, how much trouble are we in for American democracy, Daniel? Are we in danger of democracy dying?
So we wrote this book in 2018, and at the time we wrote it, a lot of people thought we were overly alarmist. And I think in retrospect, we weren't alarmist enough. We had suspected, and I had suspected, I think lots of people had suspected that, as reckless and as dangerous as Donald Trump might be, that the Republican Party would serve as a constraint, and that some of these institutions that Dick Fallon has told us about, would have served as constraints. I think we got through this situation not because of our checks and balances. I mean, in some ways, despite the failure of our checks and balances, and the failure of impeachment, for instance, last year. So the broad social science literature, if we believe the last 100 years of data, suggests that rich countries, high GDP per capita, and countries that have a long stable constitutional tradition, and the US certainly counts as that, at least since the US Civil War, are pretty safe, and so they tend not to break down. I guess what's concerned, and so that's what the data tell us. That's what history tells us. That's another way of putting it. And that the probability, given those two variables of age of a democracy and GDP per capita, the probability of American democracy dying today is much, much lower than Germany's was in 1933, given the age of democracy in 1933 and GDP per capita in 1933. So that should all be reassuring. But if any of you are like me, that's not entirely reassuring, because I do think we have the feeling that, maybe past is not just prologue and that there's something different going on. I do think that that a lot of this, I come back to the Republican Party, and I may agree with Harvey's point. I mean, in the sense that, that the Republican establishment in 2016 was not in favor of Donald Trump becoming the nominee. The big money was not behind Donald Trump becoming the nominee. And this, speaks to the structure of our primary system and so on. But I think the point here, though, is that, from my perspective, one of the key hinges here is what happens with the Republican Party. And I really think that, when you have a two-party system, if one of the parties, even if it's been hijacked, doesn't behave in ways that respects the basic rules of the democratic game, then it's really hard to imagine this for lasting for very long. And I think even you just look at the Democratic response, which I think, just in the last week, the kind of legislative procedures that the Biden administration wants to pursue, which, pursuing this massive, budget stimulus rather through reconciliation, these kinds of measures, which all, maybe, I think it's the right thing to do strategically and so on. What it does suggest is a kind of escalation on both sides. I mean, if you're a member of Congress and your life was threatened by people who you think Donald Trump supported this, and you're not going to get justice through the impeachment process, this is going to escalate things. And so I think for good reason, Democrats, are very angry about what has happened. And it requires incredible self-restraint for Democrats to just, okay, we're going to continue with business as usual. And so that, again, the question was, what are the chances? I'm not going to put a number on it, but I think we can see these trends are very worrying. And the thing to look for, again, I think, is really the Republican Party, in some sense, transforms itself. And final point on this, a lot of people will say, well, reforming the Electoral College that's like hopeless. This is so impossible, that to get 2/3 majority, and it's a constitutional change, and all of these this is all institutional engineering. This is all so difficult. But from my view, to continue to wag our fingers at Republican politicians and say you need to abide by democratic norms, that's much more naive. I think that we need to change the incentives facing Republican politicians, because there are these strands out there in our society that are violent, that are clearly anti-democratic. And what we need to do is reduce the incentive for the Republican Party to align themselves with that. That's the thing that's the biggest risk. I mean, law enforcement can deal with right-wing networks and so on. The most dangerous thing, though, is that our politicians think it's in their interest to continue to align themselves with that. And that's the thing that worries me the most.
Okay, so I do want to go to electoral reform in just a second, but I want to ask Harvey Mansfield, because Harvey, you've studied a longer scope of democracy than perhaps anybody here. And in your opinion, how much trouble is U.S. democracy in? Is there a danger in it failing in the way that Daniel Ziblatt thinks there is?
No, I don't think we're in that degree of danger. And I'm not as discouraged about the Republicans, nor do I think they've been as radical as has been alleged. So what I would say is that what I would say further is that I don't think that the racial issue has been described correctly. In America, we have a gap between the ways that Blacks live and the ways that whites or non-Blacks live, which is a major problem for us. And Republicans have their way of addressing this. And it's not racism. It's to say that it's better to improve your lot on your own. So they like the virtue of self-reliance. Whereas the Democrats are for government measures to close the gap between Blacks and whites. And they are full of compassion and empathy as opposed to self-reliance. So those are two different ways of addressing that problem. And it's not that the Republicans are racist because they don't care. They do care. They want Blacks to succeed just as much as the Democrats do, but they have a different way of, and a different program, a different attitude. So if you're a Republican, you like to admire people and to look up to people who have more than you. If you're a Democrat, it's the reverse. You look for people at the bottom, at the most vulnerable people, the people to feel sorry for. A liberal is a person who spends his life looking for people to feel sorry for. So now those are two different ways of looking at the problem. And it isn't that one of them is nasty and the other is perfect.
Thank you, Harvey. So we could have, of course, a long conversation about differences in programs for equality across the parties. One thing I think that's been widely, and this anticipates a question from the audience that I'm going to turn to Claudine Gay to ask, is one thing, of course, that's been to answer. One thing that has been recognized is that there is, of course, a white nationalist element that was at least aligned with Trump. And so there are people that are on an extreme in that party. one of the elements that's extreme, that's perhaps a new element of American politics, is conspiracy theories. And there's a question in the audience, coming from the audience, from another anonymous attendee that asked, and this has been upvoted, but I think it's a good question, is what is the chance, sorry, wrong question. Do you believe it is possible to convince the rioters that the election was not rigged and bring them back from the QAnon rabbit hole? And if so, how do we do that? So Claudine, as a student of political behavior, I'm turning to you to say, how can we bring, and I'll say, if we don't think that you want to go all the way down to the QAnon rabbit hole, how can we bring people, though, that have been maybe on the extreme in general back into the mainstream? Is this possible?
I have to confess that so much of what is unfolding right now goes so far beyond what scholars of American politics are used to talking about. I mean, it's not just, about the outrage of trying to throw out millions of legally cast ballots, but because it goes well beyond that, it's using what were previously innocuous and procedural milestones in the election certification process as now strategic choke points. I mean, so this is just a whole different way of engaging in politics. I think one of the challenges here in terms of shaping mass behavior and mass political attitudes is that you have elites and opinion leaders who continue to traffic in the conspiracy theories, and an entire media industry that seems to have organized itself around continuing to advance these conspiracy theories, often dressed in an ideological veneer that I think can be quite misleading. So, talk of, ballot integrity and election security as really as a way of kind of deflecting the reality of the situation. And I think that's what makes this very challenging, is that, when these ideas are being actively reinforced and promoted, including by elected officials, it makes it hard to affect opinion change at the level of mass behavior and mass public opinion. So I wish I had a more optimistic thoughts to share on that particular issue, but it says something that, demonstrably false claims meant to undermine public trust and in our electoral process, and rejected by, nearly 60 courts and the former U.S. Attorney General, are still being treated, including by, elites and elected officials, as just political perspectives that are worth defending. It's hard to, this is not ordinary political and policy disagreement. And it's not, I can't say with certainty, how quickly or thoroughly we can recover from this and actually begin to, disabuse, everyday folks of these conspiracy theories.
Let me pose that question slightly differently to Erica Chenoweth, and then I want to turn to a question about the courts, as somebody asked. But Erica, so broadening this a little bit, again, beyond really bizarre conspiracy theories, and I take Claudine's point about the general problem to be very true. But one thing that you pointed out, Erica, is that, of course, the attack on the U.S. Capitol, which in many ways was just, a few thousand people, is part of a much larger trend. There's people showing up with guns at capitals across the country. And so in many ways, we think this is not an isolated problem. And there's people resorting to the threat of violence to affect politics all over the country. Are there any examples, because you've studied political violence, are there examples of people turning away from political violence as a means back into mainstream democratic politics and affecting politics with their vote?
Yes, there are plenty of examples from all around the world of places where armed groups or armed extremists have been effectively demobilized and begun to participate in any number of ways in political life in nonviolent or peaceful ways, ranging from protest to voting to other forms of civic engagement. And this has been seen in many different kind of post-conflict environments. But one of the key points there is that it's been seen in post-conflict environments, meaning that there was a point at which they viewed their scene and thought, we can't get any further using armed struggle or the threat of armed struggle, and it's time to sort of say goodbye to this path. And then there was a kind of receptive process for reintegrating them into society. And so unfortunately, that's a process that's usually seen at the end of a protracted armed conflict. And so, you know, in terms of whether we're at that point now where there's a group of people who feel sufficiently kind of futile in going down this road is a really open question. I have colleagues who think that, for example, deplatforming Trump, deplatforming Parler, and some of the other platforms that these groups were using to communicate has actually been deeply unsettling and challenging for them. And that some of these groups are in kind of disarray and moments of introspection and this sort of thing. But others have argued, I think pretty convincingly, that the January 6th attacks have been incredibly emboldening, both because of the fact that it looks like many people who were participating are going to get away with it, but also because of the incredible degree of notoriety, the incredible degree of shock, the incredible interruption to the democratic process, and the fact that, honestly, many elected officials in the GOP not only won't distance themselves from the perpetrators or the people who incited the violence, but are sitting in the same halls with them, right? And they continue to hold on their seats. They continue to spread falsehoods about the nature of the election. This is incredibly emboldening to many of these extreme elements and to some of the not so extreme elements. And, you know, to get back to the last question that you asked about, like, how much trouble are we in as a democracy? One of the examples I was quite loath to bring up earlier was the beer hall putsch, which was a failed coup in 1923 in Bavaria, in which fascists tried to oust you know, an elected government to overtake Bavaria and failed, and were tried for treason and served prison time. And during that prison time, Adolf Hitler and his co-conspirators actually dictated Mein Kampf and sharpened their skills at propaganda. What is propaganda? It's disinformation, right? And they spent that time fomenting and sharpening the appeal of the big lie, that there had been a great betrayal by essentially the German establishment, that it was a conspiracy, and that the only way to really restore Germany to its true course was to expel all of the conspirators, right? And that gathered mass appeal. And like Daniel, I'm not a person who wants to be accused of being overly alarmist at any point. But there are historical examples that we can avoid if we take very seriously this pattern of behavior and stand up for the truth, facts, and absolutely reject people who are in positions of power and authority, and who want to challenge and destroy the truth. I mean, the observed actual truth, you know, the rule of law. We should have our elected officials standing up for the rule of law or demanding that they resign. That's what I think as a way to make sure that we protect our democracy.
Thank you, Erica. I want to shift gears a bit because I keep promising we're going to talk about institutions because we've mentioned them a lot. And there's a question from the audience for Professor Fallon, which is the following: what are the implications of the January 6th events, if any, on the Supreme Court? And this anonymous attendee says, I ask this both in light of the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett and Clarence Thomas's wife egging on the extremists that attacked the Capitol.
So if one wants to talk about all sorts of complicated historical and sociological networks, I'm sure one could draw many connections. But if you said to me, what effect do I think that the events in the Capitol on January 6th will have in the way that the Supreme Court does its business over the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years, I would be pretty confident in answering that question, none. That I think that the justices of the Supreme Court have a sense of themselves as judges with obligations to the rule of law, and I think they're not going to pivot in any way as a result of this. Now, that undoubtedly makes me seem like totally naive in a bad way. I think it's one of the characteristics of our Constitution that it is very old, it's very cryptic, and because it's so old and it's so cryptic, it is capable of being interpreted in different ways. And our justices have obviously tended to read the Constitution in light of or in ways that reflect their normative preferences in a variety of ways. And so it's not that there's no difference between Clarence Thomas and Sonia Sotomayor, but I don't think January 6th by itself is going to make a big difference.
So just briefly, I want to bring in one more question because it's also come up quite a bit, and then we'll ask one question in closing. But something that I alluded to earlier and has come up quite a bit is thinking about the Republican Party and putting aside differences between Republicans and Democrats or what the true nature of the Republican Party is. If we agree that the Republican Party should go a different direction, because I think everybody on this panel has said that in some way or another, either to keep a demagogue out because Trump can run again as of now in 2024, or to recapture the middle, perhaps. What can make that actually happen? And there was a good question, for example, from the audience that had contrasted some of these Republican officials that in the states, as people have mentioned, in the states sort of withstood Trump's pressure and people and the members of Congress have not. So are they an example, or can we point to some example that is a way back to the center for the Republican Party? Daniel Ziblatt, you've written about center-right parties. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have to. It has to be an appeal to their self-interest. I mean, that's and their electoral interest. And so I think that's really the thing that needs to happen. And this is it's difficult given the constraints of the fear of being if you're a Republican congressman from a very Republican district, the thing you worry about is being primary to your right. And I know the evidence is kind of the degree to which primaries polarize our politics. There's sort of mixed evidence on this, but there's a kind of always the threat of this happening. And I think that this constrains what Republican members of Congress can do. I mean, they're afraid, they want to be reelected. So that's again why I think that. I mean, that's why I'm gonna kind of repeat this same line here, that it's really critical to reform our institutions, to reform the incentives that they face, because otherwise it's just sort of wishful thinking to think. And I'll tell you the thing that really scares me is I think about there's a lot of valiant efforts of never Trump Republicans sort of trying to create movements, trying to fund candidates and so on. And what I often think of is, in the late 1920s in Weimar, there was a whole group of very sort of Tory conservatives. They thought of themselves as Tory conservatives, and they were outraged by the nationalistic turn of their party. And so they jettisoned their party, they left their party, and this is a proportional system, so this created additional barriers, and they would sort of create, these aristocrats create their own party, say, okay, we're going to create the real conservative party, and they would have these events, and nobody would be there except this group of elite friends. I mean, that's not where the voting base was. And so the kind of separation of a kind of moderate faction away from the voting, the kind of base of the party is, in a proportional system, is particularly dangerous. But I wonder to what degree, I'm not sure, I guess, to make it very concrete, is it a better thing if you have a series of more moderate Republicans or rule of law Republicans, I would call them, break from the Republican Party? I mean, I think somehow the assumption is that maybe that is a good thing, because then, let's say Mitt Romney were to join the Democrats in the Senate and caucus with the Senate Democrats. Maybe this would be a good thing, but on the other hand, this then leaves the Republican Party as a very rump, dangerous party. Maybe it can't win the presidential election. So that's maybe a question I would ask: would that be a good thing or not a good thing? And on one hand, it appears like it might be a good thing because it's a weakened Republican Party. But I think for the long run, it's hard to have a stable system without a reasonable Republican Party or conservative party. So again, yeah, I think the final thing I would just say is these institutional reforms are critical. I don't see any other way out.
I was going to ask Daniel, are there even enough moderates still left in the House to even make this possible? It all seems so polarized. Right. Certainly more so than in the Senate, where you still have, at least a small but committed group of moderates that perhaps could form the nucleus of a different kind of party. But I agree. I mean, I think the combination of the sort of structural incentives and the fear, and might even at this point say mortal fear of being primaried from the right, combined also with just kind of there's a bit of a hubris to it as well. This idea that, honestly, I think this illusion that that politicians can necessarily control and channel even the most fringe elements of the base into enduring political power. And I don't know. I think that's I think there's a lot of risk in making an assumption like that, and I think part of that was what was on display on January 6th.
If I could make a comment that begins with a kind of clarifying point, but then ends with something different. When we talk about institutional reform, there are different kinds of institutions. The Constitution sets up certain institutions. I think the gravest defect in our Constitution is it is so difficult to amend. It takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress, takes 3/4 of the states. There's no way we're going to get reform of the Electoral College. There's no way we're going to get a change from 2 senators for every state or reconfigurations of states such that there are more senators for urban areas and so forth. There are institutional things that can be done by laws that don't require these super majorities. It's possible if the Democrats are in control of enough, they can expand voting rights in the Senate. If there were a Democratic majority, a firm one, it could abolish the filibuster. So these are some things that are doable. We sometimes talk about parties as institutions because they effectively have all the roles and functions of institutions within our system. If we want to talk about the reform of the Republican Party as institutions, we can say, well, how can we go about that? Here, there's a problem about the we that comes back to a lot of the big things that we have been talking about. This is probably the hope of a naive outsider to the politics that you're experts in. But suppose we had 5 Republican senators who broke off not to go caucus with the Democrats, but to say, we're going to be the Federalists or something of that kind, and begin to put others in the Republican Party to a bit of a test, at least in the first instance. Could that have a beneficial effect? I don't know, but the big point that I wanted to make is that institutions that term can encompass a whole lot of things. Some are more easily reformed than others, and different people have the tools to reform some of them than will plausibly ever have the tools to reform others.
Okay, thank you, Dick. I want to ask one question really quickly because it's 7:30 right now, and so I'm going to do the impossible, which is ask Harvard professors to answer this in just a few sentences, which is the following, because a lot of people are worried, and I think we can all agree on that. And I just want to leave people with something they can think about, which is if they're worried and they want to make a difference, if they want to say they want to make democracy in their country a better place, what can they do? And so I'm going to go in the order we started in and ask Erica Chenoweth to go first, please. Just a few sentences.
First, find your political home and stay engaged with it. Second, find somebody you live near that you can help on a consistent basis. And third, just stay engaged with political life and don't forget your responsibilities to yourself and those around you.
Thank you. Dick Fallon.
I echo Erica in a number of ways. I think if we look at what's going on at the national level, the problems feel so profound that none of us individually can do much about any of them, and there may be a temptation just to lose hope, to give up. Harvey early on talked about the relationship between the moral and the political. Doing right starts closest to home with all the people that we are closest to, whose lives we can help to make better in small ways. And there is more hope for achieving things at the local level. So think globally, but don't absolve ourselves of responsibility to act locally, and we can make things happen locally.
Thank you. Claudine Gay.
I'll make mine really short. Vote. Stay politically engaged. Look left and right and bring other people into the political process as well.
Thank you. Harvey Mansfield.
Like that too. Think and argue. Politics is about arguing. And don't let anyone change our Constitution.
And finally, Daniel Ziblatt.
I just would say that the thing that really saved us, if not our checks and balances, are people doing their jobs, professionals, journalists, civil servants, military officers, Capitol Hill police officers, professionals abiding by professional ethics. And I think all of us, in whatever occupation we're in, have a professional code that we go by. And I think that's another form of acting locally. And it turns out that's the thing that really helps save our democracy. So all of us should abide by our own professional ethics and our professional lives. I think that's really absolutely critical and sometimes underrated.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to this wonderful panel. I've learned a lot from all of you. Thank you to all the alumni that joined us and other members of the Harvard community. Thank you to VPAL for putting this on, and everybody have a wonderful night. Thank you.